Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you are watching Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host, my name's Larry Erickson, and for about a half an hour, I'm going to be rattling on about things that I think are worth your time to know about. If you have any comments or reactions to the show, you can email me directly at whoviating, WHOVIATING, at AOL.com, or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time. You can leave a comment there, or you can get the email address from there if you like. If you do send me email, please include something in the subject line to make it clear it's not spam. And be a little patient about getting an answer, but you will get one. All right, let's get right to it then. As always, starting when I can with some good news. In this case, the news is that Governor Tom Wolf of Pennsylvania has suspended the use of the death penalty in his state. Quoting him, "If the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is going to take the irrevocable step of executing a human being, its capital sentencing system must be infallible. Pennsylvania's system is riddled with flaws, making it error-prone, expensive, and anything but infallible." In addition to the costs involved, which the yearly costs of maintaining the death penalty system, which Wolf estimated $300 million a year, the governor noted discrepancies in the racial makeup of the death row population. The result, although the governor did not say this directly, the result of a racially biased criminal justice system. As one example of many of that along that line, whites make up about half of all murder victims, but 70% of the cases where the death penalty was imposed involved a white victim. Simply, you are far more likely to be sentenced to death if you killed a white person than if you killed a black person. More strikingly, since the death penalty returned to the U.S., there have been 324 persons executed in interracial murders. Over 90% of those executions involved a black killing a white. Fewer than 10%, 31 of 329 to be exact, involved a white killing a black. And the failures of the system actually go well beyond that, affecting justice even where racial bias does not enter into it. For example, speaking of Pennsylvania in particular, a state death penalty assessment team reported what it called a systemic failure to protect innocent people from lawyers who do not provide adequate defenses. Now, that's a failure not limited to Pennsylvania, which is one of the reasons why nationally the numbers of people who were exonerated after being convicted, and I don't mean just reasonable doubt was established, I mean they were positively exonerated, including at least 111 people who had been sentenced to death before they were cleared. The number of people being exonerated keeps growing. Wolf's moratorium will last until the Pennsylvania Task Force and Advisory Committee on Capital Punishment submits guidance on the use of capital punishment, which is expected to happen sometime in the next couple of months. Now, that unfortunately means that depending upon that guidance being returned and what it actually says, it's possible that the death penalty could return to Pennsylvania. But at least for now, the Grim Reaper has to twiddle his thumbs, and that's good news. All right, moving on from there, we have several updates about things I've talked about before, trying to keep you in the loop about this stuff. The first one is something I talked about a couple of times, the arguments over same-sex marriage that's now going on in the state of Alabama. Now, as I said last week, a federal district court had ruled that the state's ban on same-sex marriage violated the U.S. Constitution. But Roy Moore, who's Chief Justice of the Alabama State Supreme Court, ordered the county probate judges who issue marriage licenses to defy that federal order. However, after one of these probate judges was directly ordered by that federal court to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, most counties in the state decided they would go along. By the end of last week, that is February 13th, at least 50 of the 67 counties that make up Alabama were issuing marriage licenses to same-sex couples. However, Judge Roy, more stupid than you can imagine, keeps at it He said on February 15th that, this is quoting him, "A trial court's decision on the constitutionality of a federal question is just that. It's an opinion." Which makes sense if and only if he's claiming that the order of a federal district court has no legal force. It's just an opinion. Which he actually probably does mean, since he's also earlier suggested that his court is on the same level as a federal circuit court of appeals, with only the U.S. Supreme Court above him. At the same time, another update on this, his court has agreed to consider a petition by two groups of anti-homosexual bigots who want the court to issue a formal order, which is known as a writ of mandamus, to all probate judges in the state, ordering them, by the state Supreme Court, ordering them to not issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. On the other hand, Judge Stephen Reed, he was the first probate judge who said he would issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples, said he didn't ask for Moore's opinion on the matter, and frankly, he didn't think he needed it. Now, he admitted that same-sex marriage is still unpopular in Alabama, but he also said that he and the others who feel the same way he does, he said, we're on the right side of history where this is concerned. And indeed they are. Next up, an update on the topic of net neutrality, which for those of you who missed last week's show, I'll say very briefly, means that all information on the internet is treated equally, with no one's information getting any kind of special treatment or special accelerated treatment over anybody else's. The FCC is scheduled to vote on February 26th on a proposal to regulate the internet in a way that would preserve the open nature, the existing open nature of the internet under which it has grown and flourished. The update here is that the opponents of net neutrality, consisting mostly of greedy telecommunications corporations like Comcast and Verizon, along with their bought-off stooges in Congress, they're intensifying their campaign of lies, misdirection, misinformation, and subtle intimidation to try to get the FCC to change its course. For example, the goppers in Congress are investigating the rulemaking process, claiming Obama improperly influenced the FCC, apparently by having an opinion about net neutrality. They are ranting about big government and how the FCC is using, quote, legal contortions and lawyer tricks to take over the internet. Meanwhile, industry groups and their various fronts are putting out ads claiming that the proposal will lead to more government surveillance and higher taxes. Meanwhile, their lobbying minions are parading through the offices of FCC staff to pressure them to create loopholes in this regulation. They're doing it with the same old cliches about how net neutrality will stifle innovation, even though innovation doesn't seem to have been stifled in all the years up till now when net neutrality has been the practice. This vote, again, is scheduled for February 26th. We'll let you know how it goes. Next up, this, I suppose, is actually more of an expansion on something I talked about last week rather than an update. Last week's Outrage of the Week involved the plan by House goppers to attack the federal disability insurance program by changing the rules in a way that makes it extremely difficult to keep the program properly funded. Well, that's not the only example we have of right-wingers trying to change the rules in a way intended to guarantee them a win. Here's another one. A rule adopted by the House of Representatives, henceforth here to be known as the Asylum, the new rule will require what's called dynamic scoring, engaging the budgetary effect of changes in taxes or spending by the federal government. What the rule does is require that more macroeconomic effects be taken into account when analyzing the cost estimates of major legislation, work that is now being done by the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation. Put more simply, what the goppers want to do is to be able to assume that any tax cuts will make the economy grow so much that the cuts will pay for themselves in increased tax revenue from this expanding economy. And if that logic sounds familiar to some of us older folks here, it's because it's what Ronald Reagan's people called trickle-down economics in the early 1980s, before this idea drove us into one of the worst recessions of the 20th century and ballooned annual federal deficits to 6 times what they had been before the Reaganites got in. Like the saying goes, first tragedy, then farce. Our next update has to do with the Keystone XL Pipeline, which I've talked about several times. This is the one intended to carry tar sands, which are about, as I always say, about the dirtiest, most polluting way to get oil there is, carrying tar sands from mines in Alberta, Canada, to refineries in Texas. Here's the latest update about this. Now, first off, as you may well know, the Asylum and the Senate recently passed bills approving the pipeline and moving the authority to approve it from the executive branch to the Congress. The amazing Mr. O has promised to veto this bill, although it's unclear if that's out of any environmental concern or just because he's getting his nose out of joint out of having some of his power taken away from him. But either way, let's hope that even if he does want to wimp out and let the bill pass, he'll realize that at this point, having threatened to veto it so many times, he can't not veto it if he expects to remain politically relevant for the rest of his term. And by the way, these bills pass with considerable support from Democrats, but because they like oil and gas corporation money as much as the Goppers do. But that support in either house was not enough to overcome a veto. Meanwhile, as I've mentioned before, the Nebraska state legislature passed a bill allowing TransCanada, which is the Canadian company that wants to build the pipeline, to file for eminent domain on properties along the route, and also stripped the state's Public Service Commission of the authority to rule on the final plans. Lower courts agreed with the suit, claiming that that violated the state constitution, but while a majority of the state Supreme Court agreed, it wasn't the supermajority required to overturn a law. Now, I've talked about all that before. The follow-up now is that shortly after the win in court, TransCanada began filing eminent domain claims for landowners who still had not agreed to turn their land over to the company. Which brings us in turn to the immediate update, which is that a county district judge in Nebraska has granted a temporary injunction to landowners who are challenging the right and ability of TransCanada to use eminent domain to take their land. Although the injunction only affects some people along the northern part of the pipeline's intended route through Nebraska, TransCanada agreed to not oppose the injunction in exchange for an accelerated trial date, and also said it will delay land condemnation proceedings against everybody who has so far resisted the corporation's attempts to take their land. Meanwhile, the U.S. State Department has been working toward making a recommendation on whether or not construction of the pipeline is in the national interest. That recommendation was delayed, supposedly, to await the resolution of that case that was before the Nebraska Supreme Court. That case, of course, now has been resolved. However, don't be surprised if this new case generates another delay in making that final recommendation. Which actually is good, frankly, because it seems that the longer this whole thing about the pipeline drags out, the less vital the pipeline seems, and more the and less vital, in fact, the whole thing of tar sands seems. And plus, the more transparent all the lies about all the jobs that the project was supposed to produce, all those transparent, those lies become, again, I'm garbling my words, but the lies become even more transparent over time. So the more this drags out, the better it is. As a footnote to that, by the way, it develops that tar sands activists in Oregon, Washington State, and Idaho who have participated in protest against the Keystone XL Pipeline and involved in protests against tar sands projects, they've been getting visits from the FBI. The agents have reportedly been targeting activists who have protested what are called megaloads. These are huge truckloads of equipment for tar sands extraction. A megaload can be longer than a football field and take up 2 lanes of a highway. And some of these protests have blockaded the equipment, blocked the highway, and so delayed the equipment shipment. Now, the FBI insists that it does not investigate political activity, only crime. However, the people who've been contacted say the approach of the agents has been consistently along the lines of saying something like, we're not doing criminal investigation, you are not under any suspicion of a crime, but we're trying to learn more about the movement. Which would suggest either that the FBI is on a fishing expedition trying to find some major crime behind actually relatively straightforward nonviolent civil disobedience, or as I think more likely, they are trying to intimidate opponents of the pipeline with a "we know who you are and we are watching you" attitude, which produces some 60s flashbacks. Hopefully the intimidation tactics will be as much of a failure now as they were then. And we're going to take a break. And here we are back. And we're back with one of our regular weekly features. It's the Clown Award, given as always for meritorious stupidity. The winners of the Big Red Nose this week are a couple of meathead students at Flower Mound High School of Flower Mound, Texas. It must have been a heck of a high school basketball game. It went to a triple overtime. This is on February 13th. It was between Flower Mound and the mostly African-American team from Plano East. Late in the game, this happened. A couple of students in the Flower Mound student section holding up signs facing the Plano East bench reading "White Power." Now, some have suggested this was actually just a coincidence, a moment of transition taken out of context and given authority by the power of social media. The argument in its strongest form is that the white sign likely referred in some way to the Flower Mound school colors, which are blue and white, and the power sign was supposedly part of a cheer of Jaguar Power, the Jaguars being the team's name. Frankly, I don't buy it, and I'll tell you why. According to multiple witnesses, the signs are up long enough for the Plano East students to notice it, start pointing at it, and for Flower Mound teachers to rush up into the stands to have the signs be taken down. One Plano East student estimated the signs are up for a good 30 seconds. Now, that's not a coincidence, okay? That's not a mistake. If you want to say blue and white, you don't hold up just white for 30 seconds. If you want to say Jaguar Power, you don't hold up power, just power, for 30 seconds. This was no mistake. Especially not when witnesses said that there were racial epithets against the Plano East team called out during the game, and doubly especially not when players from Plano East discovered after the game that their team bus had been urinated and defecated on. Now, neither school has confirmed that particular point, but local TV reported that what they called enough students had. You know, high school students, especially male high school students, can be jerks at times. It kind of goes with the territory. So they need to be cut a certain degree of slack. They can clown around, they can even be clownish even. But when that clownishness crosses over into outright racial bigotry, then they have, without a doubt, become clowns. All right, next up, I guess this is sort of an update, more or less. Under the heading of the little thing, I talked about the report that a new 350-member anti-terrorism task force was being established by Police Commissioner Bill Bratton in the New York Police Department. A task force armed with high-tech weapons and machine guns, and which was going to be patrolling ordinary protests, apparently because they were some sort of terroristic threat. Well, apparently it turns out I wasn't the only one who noticed that reference to protest, and the NYPD has been backpedaling furiously ever since. Oh, no, it was all a misunderstanding, you see. Because when Bratton said members of the so-called strategic response group would be armed with machine guns, he didn't mean that strategic response group. No, he meant some other strategic response group, which has some other name or something. Anyway, it turns out for now that the Strategic Response Group, which will be dealing with demonstrations, is not and is separate from the anti-terrorism force and will not be outfitted with machine guns, and thank God for small favors. Instead, not the anti-terrorism unit will consist of 550 specially trained officers to handle demonstrations and protests, and to handle any sort of civil disorder, and to respond to citywide mobilizations, which still sounds very much like demonstrations are regarded as a threat of civil disorder. But hey, at least this way you'd only be clubbed, maced, and tasered, not machine gunned. That update actually brings us around to our other regular weekly feature. This is the Outrage of the Week. Earlier this month, a committee of the New York State Senate held a hearing on protests against police brutality. This was sparked to a significant degree by the Eric Garner case, where a black man was choked to death by NYPD cops. Among those testifying was NYPD Commissioner Bill Bratton. What was his considered answer to cases like Eric Garner? What was his answer to police violence that has led to such unnecessary deaths and tragedies? His answer was to urge the lawmakers to increase the penalties for resisting arrest from a misdemeanor to a felony. That was his answer. We need to get around this idea that you can resist arrest, he later said. It results in potential injuries to the officer, to the suspect, and we need to change that, and the way to change it is to start penalties for it. Because you see, cops in New York and elsewhere have been claiming that Eric Garner's death would have been prevented if he hadn't tried to resist arrest. Because if he resisted, well, 5 or 6 cops just had to jump on him. Cops just had to put him in a chokehold, which had been long banned by the NYPD precisely for the risk of doing to people what it did to Eric Garner. Because cops just had to keep him in the chokehold, even as he lay face down on the pavement, gasping that he couldn't breathe. Because blaming the victim is always the first choice. And that woman should have known better than to wear a short skirt, so whatever happened to her was her own fault. Why is victim blaming the only thing that Bill Bratton could think of to do? I mean, this would be unconscionable even if resisting arrest was not usually an add-on charge to cover up for brutality by some cop. Samuel Walker, he's an author of several books on policing and civil liberties, and he's a professor emeritus at the University of Nebraska. He said recently, quoting him, "There's a widespread pattern in American policing where resisting arrest charges are used to sort of cover, and that phrase is used, the officer's use of force." Now, in fact, I got to admit, this is nothing new. I mean, I can recall back in the dreaded 60s, it was assumed that if you were going to take part in a sit-in or something and you got clubbed or in some other way roughed up or beaten while you were being arrested, you could assume you were going to be charged with resisting arrest and probably assaulting an officer. But the fact of this longevity of this practice doesn't make it any better. And what it does, though, is it reveals patterns of brutality. A researcher recently looked at NYPD arrest stats since 2012 and found that just 5% of officers in that force accounted for 40% of all claims of resisting arrests. In fact, more than half of NYPD cops never filed a single resisting arrest charge. He also found that blacks in New York City are more likely than whites to be charged with resisting arrest, even when they're being brought in for the same crime. How is making resisting arrest a felony going to change that? Of course, the answer is it won't. It'll just mean even greater racial injustice and greater potential for cops to abuse their powers. Because remember, what constitutes resisting arrest is pretty much up to the definition of the cop. Technically, anything other than active cooperation with arrest could be called resisting. Remember back in the anti-war and civil rights protests of the 50s and 60s, when going limp when you were arrested was a common tactic. You didn't resist arrest, but you made the cops go to the effort of having to carry you off. Well, now Bill Bratton would want all of those people sent to prison for a felony. Because if resisting is a felony, oh, well then Eric Garner, angry, frustrated, feeling harassed and hassled, he, of course, at the moment one of those cops said anything about being arrested, he just would have instantly gone, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir, here are my arms behind my back, sir. Or maybe the cops playing blame the victim actually would prefer to imagine him saying, yes, massa. I called it an outrage when Bratton was first hired as police commissioner of New York. I have no reason to change my mind. Claiming that the answer to cop violence is to give them more power to send more people to prison on trumped-up charges of resisting arrest. Claiming the best way to prevent future Eric Garners is to blame all the Eric Garners for their own deaths and injuries. That is disgusting. It's unconscionable. It's an outrage. All right, I'm going to finish this up as quick as I can. Back on November 5th. President Hopi Changey said he would ask Congress for new war power authorities to fight the Islamic State. Well, now 3 months later, he's finally gotten around to doing it. 6 months after he began the bombing campaign, which so far has cost more than $1 billion, involved more than 1,700 airstrikes, and so roughly 3,000 U.S. troops sent to Iraq. And he's finally put forth his proposal, even though he continues to insist that he don't need no stinking authorization because he's the commander-in-chief, damn it. And besides, the 2001 authorization to use military force, or the AUMF, gives him all the authority he needs. What he will do is grandly allow Congress to agree with him. His proposed new AUMF would limit military action against ISIS to 3 years, absent a renewal of authority, and would repeal the 2002 AUMF that was the basis for the Iraq War, but would not repeal the 2001 AUMF, the one he's been relying on all along, which means under his proposal, whether or not Congress passes this thing, it won't make any difference. What's more, the restrictions it would place on his lovely little war have more loopholes than a fancy lace doily. For one, it supposedly limits the U.S. forces, ground forces, to things like rescue operations and intelligence sharing. But what it actually says is that they can't be used for, quoting, enduring offensive ground combat operations, a description vague enough that even party loyalist Dick Durbin was moved to ask, what does it mean? What's more, there's no geographical limit. It just says it can be against ISIS or associated persons or forces. Now, considering that, as has happened with Al-Qaeda, previously unrelated forces are now claiming that they are ISIS, as has happened in Libya, the bombing could not only, as of now, be Iraq and Syria and Libya, but in the future could undoubtedly be other places as well. This is not a prescription for limited war or targeted war, but for endless war on shifting targets. In other words, it's the same crap we've been seeing for the last 13 years. When he was running for president in 2008, a major part of Obama's foreign policy allure was his vow to move the country away from launching open-ended, ill-defined wars with few restrictions and no strategic endgame. Like so many other things, it's turned out that, well, he talked real purty, and it didn't mean a blessed thing. We'll see you next week. Have the best week you possibly can. There's going to be more on this. Peace.